guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I'm bringing you my April wrap up. So April was an amazing reading month for me. I participated in the Owl's Magical Readathon that was hosted by G over at Book Roast. By the time we got to the end of the Owls, I did sadly only manage to achieve 11 out of the 12 possible Owls, but I did manage to get all the ones I needed to be a potioneer. So I will be continuing to pursue that career in August during the Newts. The only one of the 12 that I didn't manage to get was Divination, and that is because I DNF'd the book that I did originally have in for that prompt, and then I was literally reading my book for charms down to the wire on the 30th of April, and I think I finished with 14 minutes to spare, which was not time to even squeeze in a graphic novel to finish off the Owls. So like I said, my reading month was amazing. That was both in quantity and quality. As you will see when we get to my stats, I had a lot of 5-star reads in April. While I do still give out quite a few, I don't give out as many as I used to. So I did read an awful lot of great books this month. Quantity wise, I actually had my best reading month ever. I beat my best reading month, which was last June, by 80 something pages. So not by a massive amount, but I've read more than I ever read before, and man does it feel like it. I am tired now. So I did read a total of 12 books in the month of April, but I have already posted a mid-month wrap up. So if you would like to hear my thoughts on any of these books, which is The Dead House by Dawn Curtigate, Children of the Whales Volume 4 by Abby Umeda, Fortuna Swan and Restless Slumber by KJ Sutton, Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin, and also Maybe Now by Colleen Hoover, then I will pop a link up here to my mid-month wrap up so you guys can go and check that out. So in the month of April, I read a total of 4,562 pages, which brought down to an average of 152 pages per day. I had 2 2-star reads, 3 3-star reads, 1 4-star read, and 6 5-star reads. This broke down to an average of 3.9 per book. For the demographics, we had 6 young adult books, 1 new adult, and 5 adult. For the formats, we had 8 standard physical books, 1 audiobook, 1 ARC, 1 ebook, and 1 manga. For the genres, we had 8 fantasies, 1 contemporary, 1 romance, 1 horror, and 1 science fiction. And as for the places where I sourced these books, 5 of them I have hauled in 2020, 3 of them came from my pre-existing own TBR before the start of 2020, 3 of them were either sent to me by publishers or the authors, and 1 of these books I did read on Scribd. So the first book I completed in the second half of April was Aurora Burning by J. Kristoff and Amy Kaufman. This is a review copy that was kindly sent to me by the guys over at One World Publication, so thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to read this early. The release date for this is the 5th of May, which also happens to be my birthday. This is the second book in the Aurora cycle, which is J. Kristoff and Amy Kaufman's newest young adult science fiction series. Now, as this is a sequel, I can't tell you too much about the plot of this, but the first book in this series, Aurora Rising, follows Squad 312, who are led by Tyler Jones. Now, Tyler Jones is absolutely amazing at everything that he does, and he is set to graduate at the top of his class from the Aurora Academy. However, he does end up being late to the graduation ceremony because he is busy saving a girl from the 200-year-old wreckage of a spaceship. Because of his lateness, instead of being able to pick from the cream of the crop, Tyler has to pick from the bottom of the barrel and ends up with a crew made out of the people that nobody else wanted. This story really begins when Squad 312 end up going on their first mission and discover that the girl that Tyler saved, Aurora, has actually stowed away on their ship, and she also seems to have some mysterious powers that she didn't have before Tyler saved her from the wreckage. So the second book in this series is much like the first. I did enjoy the second book slightly more. I gave Aurora Rising 4 stars. I gave Aurora Burning 5 stars. Now, my favorite thing about this book and about this series is Squad 312. This series has an excellent found family element, which is one of my favorite tropes. I just love it when characters come together and they end up caring about each other more than they've ever cared about anybody else, and we definitely get those vibes in here. The dialogue in this series is a little bit cheesy. It's very campy. All of the characters represent a different stereotype, and they do really lean into those stereotypes, and this book and the characters in it are just really extra. We have epic space chase scenes in here. There's wild costumes, big mega plot twists, like super dramatic and cheesy. I kind of compare this to Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the way that it does that, because it is campy, it is cheesy, but it's not bad. It does it in a way that really works, which is a very hard medium to hit with me because I don't often like really fun, silly stories, but this is one that I can say that I definitely 100% adore. I did have a couple of issues with this. One is that the entire plot of this second book rests on a plot twist that has been very obvious to me from the beginning of the first book. Now, I do understand that the characters don't see things the way the reader does, so it's not as obvious to them. However, I feel like it was a little bit cheap having the entire plot hinge on this thing that has been really apparent to the reader. I'm not sure whether it was intentional or whether I was just really good at spotting it, but I did kind of roll my eyes when that turned out to be like the big reveal of this book. But overall, I did really love this. It has a big dramatic emotional ending, so I am just so desperate to read the third book. I think the third book is going to contain some element of time travel, which I'm a little bit unsure about. It depends how it's pulled off if they do go the time travel route, but I'm definitely very excited to see how these characters manage to get themselves out of the situation they're in right at the end of this book. The second book I finished was Blood Heir by Emily Wenzel. This was my least favorite book of the month, one of my least favorite books of the year, and I was just so disappointed by this because I really thought I was going to love it going into it, and it just missed every mark for me. So in the UK this is published as adult, but in the US it is published as young adult. I classify it as adult because the way I work out the demographics is what market they're placed into in the United Kingdom. So for the purpose of talking about this, I will be referring to it as an adult book. So this is an adult fantasy that is inspired by Anastasia Romanov, who is the historical figure that the animated movie Anastasia was based on. Our main character in this book is also called Anastasia, and she is the princess of her kingdom. However, a year previous to the start of this story, she had to flee because she was framed for the murder of her father. Now, the plot of this is that Anastasia is trying to clear her name, and to do this, she heads down to a high security prison and she breaks out a notorious criminal called Ramzan Quicktongue, and they strike up a bargain that in exchange for him helping Anastasia find the person who actually killed her father, she will then use her magical abilities to help him get revenge on the people that wronged him. Now, the magical powers in here are called affinities. You can have different types of affinities. Our main character has an affinity to blood, and that means that she can physically manipulate the blood in other people's bodies, so she can literally pick them up by their blood and hurl them across the room and things like that. We do have a whole range of characters in here with affinities because one of the main plot threads throughout this book is that people who have an affinity are very much looked down upon and treated as slaves. They are actually slaves in a lot of cases. So I had a couple of problems with this. The one that I got the most annoyed about is not necessarily the reason why I like this book the least. It was just one of those things where I could very clearly pinpoint how it just wasn't right, and it's that I really do not see how this was an Anastasia retelling. I tried to compare it both to the actual historical recounting of what happened to the Romanov family and also the romanticized version that's present in the animated movie, and I just could really not for the life of me figure out how this book paralleled Anastasia, how this book was a retelling or inspired by Anastasia in any way, aside from that the character of Ramzan Quicktongue pretty much follows the character arc of Dmitri in the animated movie. Aside from that, we just have a princess who ran away in a Russian or Slavic inspired setting. That is pretty much the only comparisons that I could draw, so I was a little bit annoyed as multiple times in different reviews when this book was being marketed in different interviews, I've heard this pegged as a loose retelling of Anastasia, and I just could not see it. However, my main issue with this book was not necessarily the writing. There was nothing wrong with the writing. There was nothing overly special about it either, but it wasn't bad writing. I just was not gripped by this book at all. I found myself reading pages and realizing that I hadn't retained any information from what I'd read. I'm struggling to give you a review of this book now, and I only read it a week ago because just nothing from this book, from this plot, has actually stuck with me. And at the time, you know, I did think that that could be me, that I could be lacking focus when I was reading, but I did read other things alongside this book. It took me quite a while to read this one, and everything else I was absolutely fine with. It was just this one that I just could not get to grips with at all. Aside from that, there were a few annoying incidences in the plot. We have a character in here who we start out thinking is a bad guy, and then he just flips sides throughout the entire end of this book. First he's a bad guy, then you think he may be good, then oh no, he's a bad guy again, and then he's back on the side of good, and it just seemed like this character was just fulfilling every role that needed to be fulfilled in the conclusion of this novel. And with the magic system, we also had similar incidences where the scope of people's affinities aren't really laid out, which allowed the author to give anybody any magical ability that they needed to in the time. There are different types in here, like you have flesh magic, and there is a main character who controls blood, there is somebody who controls fear, someone who controls emotions, and you know, I just thought it was different types of the magic until we got near the end and somebody had the ability to very specifically control marble. So not even rock, not even stone, specifically marble, and I just thought that that aspect just made it completely unbelievable for me. So sadly, this was a miss for me. I know a few people do quite enjoy this, and it could just be me, like this book could just not resonate with me, but overall I was extremely disappointed and really not impressed. I then reread a book via audiobook, which was Love is a Many Trouser Thing by Louise Renison. This is the 8th book in the Confessions of Georgia Nicholson series, which is a young adult contemporary series that is my favourite series from my childhood. The last book in this series was published the year that I went to college, and for whatever reason I never read it, so I am currently listening to the entire series in audiobook format so I can get to the point that I can finally read the last book in this series and find out how it ends. So this is quite a basic contemporary series in its plot. We follow a girl who is 14 at the beginning of the series, and I believe that she's 16 by the end, and this series is just her diary as she is growing up, as she's exploring her identity, as she's meeting boys, having crushes on boys, being rejected by boys, and all of the crazy things that her friends get up to as well. So plot wise, there isn't a lot of one in this, I guess is what I'm saying, but I love this series so much. Partially it's a nostalgia thing. I don't think that this series particularly holds up to the test of time. There are quite a few jokes in here that would now be considered inappropriate, but in the early 2000s it was perfectly normal. I do find these books extremely relatable to my teenage experience. I mean, I was nowhere near as funny as Georgia, but I do find her experience to be incredibly relatable, which is one of the reasons that I love these books. I also particularly enjoy the audiobooks because they are narrated by Louise Renison herself, and the characters in here do have a made-up language and also things that they've made up, like a snogging scale, and because of that I don't think that anybody else could have done these audiobooks justice aside from Louise Renison, because she is the voice of Georgia and the audiobooks are just as hilarious as reading this physically. So I did give this 5 stars. There is no other rating I could have given this. I do believe I've given one book in the series 4 stars because not a lot happened in it, but this was one of my favourite ones in the series that I've reread so far, and I'm super excited to continue reading these and get to the end of the series because there were so many laugh out loud moments and it honestly just brought me joy. Next I read Lady of Light and Shadows by C.L. Wilson. This is the 2nd book in the Tyrant Soul series, which is an adult fantasy romance series that follows a Fae king called Rain Tyrant Soul, who is trying to save the entire race of the Fae, as they are very closely tied to a big magical creature called a Tyrant, which is like a winged cat, and something is happening to all of the Tyrant which is causing them to die out, and if the Tyrant die out then so will the Fae. So while Rain is searching for the answer to his problem, he does come across a young human girl called Elisetta Barastani, and as soon as he lays eyes on her he realizes that she is his true mate. Now this takes her completely by surprise, and he does go from 0 to 100 in the space of 10 seconds and falls madly in love with her. But this series overall is just about their relationship. It also has a fantasy plot line that hinges on a war that took place 1,000 years ago that a lot of the Fae actually did fight in, and the origins of Elisetta are not as clear-cut as everybody originally thought, and it seems that she may not be human after all. So I gave this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, but I don't foresee myself ever giving a book in this series higher than 4 stars, and the reason for that is the romantic elements in this series. You guys know I enjoy my fantasy romance, but I do prefer some types of romance to other types. As soon as Rain lays eyes on Elisetta, he knows that she is his soulmate, and because of the nature of romance as a genre, you know that these two are going to be endgame. It's definitely not high risk in that aspect because I fully don't expect either of them to die throughout the entirety of this series. This takes place in a historical kind of setting. It's not like real world historical, but things like propriety and courting are a key part of the social system in this world, and because of that it doesn't really leave too much room for for angst, it's pretty much clear cut, like these two are gonna fall madly in love and be together forever, but a fantasy plotline will interrupt them. That is just generally not my favorite kind of romance. I do prefer more angsty romances. So because of that, I will never overwhelmingly love any books in this series, but I do think that the romance is compelling. I think the sex scenes are well written because this is an explicit fantasy romance series, and I do like the characters of Elisetta and Rain. Now, when I was reading the first book, there was a big element of insta-love in there, but I still preferred the romance aspects over the fantasy aspects. But with this second book, I did actually prefer the fantasy elements and what was going on as opposed to the romance. Now, the main fantasy conflict in here is between the mages and the fae. 1000 years ago, there was a war where Rain's past mate was slaughtered, which caused him to scorch the earth and kill millions of people. Now, because of that, there's a lot of enmity between the mages and the fae, and the main fantasy plotline for the first two books is the fae trying to get the human population to believe them that the mages are the enemy, all the while the mages are working in the background to target Elisetta. So I don't really have too much to say on this. Aside from that, I do really like this series. Romance is good, sex scenes are good, enjoy the fantasy plotline. If you're looking for fantasy romance, then I would recommend. Just be aware that the insta-love in the first book is really annoying. Next up, I read the first 130 pages of the Books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. I am a co-host for Le Guin Along, which is a read-along of this entire beast that was created by Ashley from A Frolic Through Fiction. We will be doing live shows on the books in this series as well. Actually, the day that I'm filming this, the first live show is taking place a little bit later tonight. So if you would like to hear our full discussion on the first book in this series, The Wizard of Earthsea, I will put the link to that down in my description box for you guys. So the Books of Earthsea are classic fantasy. The first few books at least are young adult. I'm not sure about the rest of them, but it is a very classic coming of age story where we follow a wizard called Ged from a very young age, and he starts to display that he has some very powerful magic abilities. So he is sent to a wizard school. Now, because Ged is very good at everything, he has a little bit of arrogance and he doesn't like anybody else to be better than him. So one day he does decide to show off, and he releases this shadow into the world that then haunts him for many years to come. And the plot of the first book in this series is about that shadow and him overcoming it. So I gave the first book in this series 3 stars. I have heard that the series does pick up from there. I just was not particularly compelled. It was only 130 pages, and I do have an edition where the text is absolutely tiny, but it just felt like I was reading this forever. I don't mind Ursula K. Le Guin's writing style too much. I didn't think that it was especially compelling, but it is quite common to find a writing style that we're unused to when reading classic stories. And considering that this is a classic fantasy, the first book was published in 1967 or 68, I believe, I didn't think that the writing was too inaccessible. It was a little bit more complicated than a modern audience is used to, but it is by far not the most difficult writing style I've read. My issue with her writing though is not the style, but how she writes the story, I want to say. I didn't like the world building in this because I found that it wasn't integrated as I like. Every time we arrive in a new destination in this book, and considering it is quite short, there are a lot of new destinations, there would be a page of just description, like it's a fishing village, they string nets between the houses, a river runs through the middle, the women all wear blue skirts. That would be the extent of the world building, just a page at the beginning of the chapter that tells you what this town looks like, and then you would get back into the plot. So almost every time I started a new chapter, I found it very difficult to get into because I had to get through this page of description before we actually continued with what Ged was doing. And naturally I did find that quite jarring, which impacted my enjoyment of this and also made me quite reluctant to pick it up. That being said, I did enjoy the first 2/3 of the book. I liked learning about Ged, the place that he was from, how he got to the magic school, everything that was going on there. But the last third of this book just took place on the sea on a series of boats, and the world that this is set in is a series of islands. So if you have to travel anywhere, you have to go by boat. But the entire last 40-50 pages of this were entirely at sea, and it followed a lot of mundane things like Ged watching the sunrise from his boat boat or a storm or big waves, and it uses a lot of sailing terminology as well. So I did find the last third of this book incredibly hard to get through, but I do see the potential in here. I do want to continue with the series, and 3 stars isn't a bad rating. What I will say about this book though and about this series is that something that surprised me is that all of the main characters in here are actually POC, and the antagonists right at the beginning of the book are pale-skinned savages, and I did find that very interesting considering that this book was published in 1968, as that is definitely a direct subversion of anything that a reader would expect. It is kind of subtle, so I'm not sure how noticeable it would have been to readers, but dark-skinned protagonists were definitely not the norm in 1968, so I definitely appreciate that Ursula K. Le Guin did that. And then the final book that I read in the month of April, the one that took me to 11:45 p.m. on the 30th of April, is actually my second favourite book of the year and now one of my favourite books of all time, and that was The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in the Mistborn series. This series is a lot of people's favourite series. Brandon Sanderson is a lot of people's favourite fantasy authors, and I can definitely see why, because I just fell in love with this story. So quite obviously I gave this 5 stars. This is the first book in an adult epic fantasy series that follows a man called Kelsia and a girl called Vin. The most common thing that is known about this series is the magic system. In this world, people can ingest metals and then they use those metals to manifest magical abilities. Now only the nobility have this power, and the majority of people who do have any elementic powers can only control one metal. However, there is a very small percentage of the population that can actually use all 10 of the metals, and these people are known as Mistborn. Our 2 main characters in here, Kelsia and Vin, are both indeed Mistborn, and this story starts out with Kelsia gathering a crew to overturn the final empire. Now the whole background of this story is that 1000 years ago there was a prophesized hero and a Dark Lord, and the Dark Lord won, and he has become the ruler of the final empire that Kelsia is trying to overturn. My favorite thing about this, and my favorite thing about Brandon Sanderson, I have read a couple of Brandon Sanderson's books before, but it still takes me by surprise every time I read a new one, is how accessible his writing is. The writing of this book is not daunting at all. I would say that aside from just it being long, there is absolutely nothing to be scared of going into this series, because Brandon Sanderson's writing is not dense at all, and he does pretty much hold your hand all the way through the explanation of the politics of this world, the magic system, and everything like that you normally have to dig really hard for in adult fantasy. That being said, one of my only negatives about this book, and it is a very small negative, is that the explanation and the setup for this story is a little bit hand-holdy. We have Kelsia, who is a Mistborn. He's known as the survivor of Hathsin because he escaped from a place where prisoners are sent that nobody has ever escaped from, and he did this because he is a Mistborn. Now when he returns to the city of Luthadel to start his plan to overthrow the final empire, he does see a young girl called Vin who is a street rat, and she is one of my favorite characters ever, and he recognizes in her some of his own powers, so he brings her into the crew and quickly discovers that she is a Mistborn. So this book is third person, but we mainly follow Kelsia and Vin, and the way that you learn the magic system throughout this book is through the eyes of Vin as Kelsia teaches it to her. So it's very much a step-by-step. Vin asks a question about magic and Kelsia answers it, and that is how the reader learns the magic system. Now I am used to adult fantasy where you really have to dive and figure things out on your own, so I did think it was a little bit too easy that I had everything handed to me right at the beginning. However, that being said, I do usually quite enjoy an info dump at the beginning of a epic fantasy book so that I go into the story with a lot of the knowledge. However, I did just think that the way it was done in this was pretty obvious, and because of that it did take me out of the story a little bit because I could clearly see what Brandon Sanderson was trying to do. But aside from that, I love absolutely everything about this book. It has an epic plot line. I did predict some of the things that were happening, but this book doesn't pull punches. It spends a lot of time building up the characters of Kelsia and Vin, and I knew as soon as I started this book and that started happening that this meant that this was going to be a book that impacts me emotionally, and it very much does. There are a couple of tragic things that happen in here that I'm still really sad about, and the last line of this book just really made my heart hurt. At the beginning, Vin is a little bit annoying because she's had quite a rough upbringing. She is very distrustful of everything, which as a reader can be a little bit irritating to read, but it is very realistic as to what her character would be feeling at the time. And we do follow a massive arc of progression and growth on behalf of Vin, which I really appreciated, and I now absolutely adore her. I also love Kelsia. It is really hard to talk about this without gushing, but I really love the plot of this. I really love the characters. This also has a really great found family element, which I absolutely adored. There's also a romance plot line in here that I didn't expect going into it, but once again I absolutely loved. I really like the magic system and how logic based it is. Also, the manifestations of the magic system were things that I didn't expect, because when you hear that people eat metal and it turns into magic, it sounds a little bit odd, and it definitely sounded odd to me before I went into this. But my favorite of the magical abilities in here is that the characters can push and pull on metal to move themselves physically. So this leads to a lot of movement that is like flying in this book, and if you combine that with fighting technique and also use of the other allomantic powers, it leads to some pretty epic action scenes. Action scenes and fighting scenes in books are not my favorite, but I absolutely love this. It was super badass and remind me a lot of Star Wars actually in the elements of fighting in here. Yeah, it was just badass. I love it. I cannot gush about this book enough, as you probably noticed, and I would definitely recommend reading this, especially if you are looking for a book or a series that is a good transition between young adult and adult. So that is it. Those are my reviews of the 6 books I read in the second half of April. Please let me know if you have read any of the books I've talked about today and how you felt about them, and also please let me know what your favorite book of April is, because I would love to know. But aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.